Friends, welcome. Good afternoon, good morning for some of you, and this is In the Movement. So this is a webinar series that we do through Equal Justice USA and specifically the Evangelical Network. And our goal here is that we want to engage and elevate voices in the movement, meaning the justice movement. And so we talk about things like mass incarceration, and we would say mass incarceration is not just the thing that we're focusing on, it's a symptom of a greater problem. Underneath that is an obsession and an overlap of punishment and justice, which is something that we want to separate. And that's especially significant for Christians, as Christians talk about things like forgiveness and mercy. Sometimes we talk about the verse that is most repeated and the command that comes up most often in Scripture, which is do not fear. And so much of our criminal legal system is based on that fear. And we want to work and move against that and talk about what does restoration and what does healing look like there. So Equal Justice USA, we're a national nonprofit of about 35 people spread out across the US. And our goal is to repeal the death penalty. And we want to help communities think about what does it look like to respond to harm or violence without centering prosecution, police, or prisons. What would it look like to have restoration and healing at the center of a goal once violence happens? And rather than continue that cycle, to interrupt it. And so specifically today, our topic is going to be around mass incarceration, prosecution, trauma, and healing. And so our guest is the executive director of EJUSA, Jamila Hodge. And Jami, thank you, friend, for being here.
I'm so excited for the conversation. Thank you, Sam, for the invitation.
Absolutely. We're going to talk for a bit. If you all have come before, you know that we'll talk for a bit, and then we'll make sure to save some time at the end for any questions that people have. So feel free to put any questions that come up for you in the chat. You can put those in the Q&A feature, and we'll save some time at the end, and we'll circle back to those. So one thing I was saying to Jami right before we began is we're going to use prosecution and the role of a prosecutor kind of as a nexus for all things that we'll talk about today, because that was Jami's former role before moving into other places and spaces. And that's one of the things that's the most influential in the system, and yet also the least engaged and understood. And so we really want to peel back the layers of what a prosecutor is and what they do. Some things to keep in mind, though, as we talk about prosecution and mass incarceration. We often talk about that we have about 2 million people in jail or prison within this country. But another number that we don't often say is that there's an additional 3.7 million people on probation or parole. And so combining that, it's over 5 million people. This is a massive system beyond just those almost 2 million who are incarcerated and locked up. Keep in mind the 2,400 people on death row. Keep in mind there have been 190 exonerations. So we know, at least by that measure of innocence and being careful, that the death penalty is not working. Think also about this. We have about 400,000 people in this country who are in pretrial detention. And think of what that means. It's people who are legally innocent, but waiting on a trial. And those individuals are confined as they wait for their case to move forward. So we want to give a knowledge or a nod to those individuals as well. And then we'll talk about this as well, but keep in mind that the median bail bond for a felony in our country is about $10,000. And that'll play a role in some of the ways that bail and that bond and that pretrial system leads to some ways of discriminating against others. So we'll unpack a lot of those things, but here's where we'll start. Jami, talk us through a crime happens and what is the role of a prosecutor?
Yeah. So again, thank you, Sam, and it's great to be here. And I served as a prosecutor for about 12 years in the Washington, D.C. area. And essentially, I think what a lot of folks, more people are starting to realize there's been some real advocacy efforts to help pull back the veil of what prosecutors do, because the vast majority in this country are elected. So folks have a say in who is the head of their prosecutor's office. But essentially, they're one of the most powerful actors in the systems. And what I mean by that is, if you think about a crime happens and there's, police who usually are the ones who respond and, apprehension, they make an arrest. Pretty much everything that happens from there is determined by the decisions the prosecutors make. So at that very point of interaction, a prosecutor can either charge that case, they can charge it as a misdemeanor, which, is a lower level, carries a year or less in time. They can charge it as a felony if the elements are there to make out a felony. they can not charge it at all. They can,
Mhm.
and often some reasons for that are if the person's rights were violated, there was a search, that there wasn't probable cause or other authority for the police to conduct that search, or maybe there's a recognition that what the arrest is for actually doesn't rise to the level, although it technically may meet the elements. There's a lot of discretion to say, you know what, I just don't think this is the kind of thing I'm going to bring into the system. I remember when I used to charge cases, literally there's so much discretion that there were certain categories of cases that certain prosecutors just wouldn't charge. There were prosecutors who were like, I'm never going to charge someone who's stealing food, because that there's such a basic need. I'm
And
just
those are
going
just
to
personal decisions of the
personal
prosecutor.
decisions that the prosecutor makes, and they just will not charge the case. The prosecutor also can decide whether or not what's charged carries a mandatory minimum. And what that means is you can charge a case in a way where if there's a conviction, regardless of what the judge thinks, who ultimately is responsible for sentencing, there's a mandatory amount the person will have to serve. You find that a lot in the federal system. It also exists in our local systems, but it's why, sometimes you think of a courtroom and everyone rises and the judge clearly is the most powerful person in that room. I would say there are lots of times when actually no, because even if the judge wanted to, if you have charged a mandatory minimum, there is nothing they can do. That person, once convicted, will serve that mandatory time. And so essentially, I think of prosecutors often as this gatekeeper. Again, they can choose to let that incident come into the system, and all the system has. Another option that I didn't mention is diversion, which is where instead of bringing the case in for a traditional sort of go through an investigation conviction, you instead say, I'm going to refer this case out so that needs can be met. Maybe it's anger management classes or cognitive behavioral therapy or substance use treatment, instead of pursuing a conviction. And there's, some conditions usually tied to all of that. But again, prosecutors ultimately can be that gatekeeper.
That's a great word for it. And it often, some of those other options other than pursuing prosecution, it totally depends on, I hear gatekeeper moments. One, what's offered in that locality, because some things may, like if restorative justice is an option, it may not be in a county over here. And then another layer of what the prosecutor wants to do, and that person has so much discretion in what they do.
Yes.
How do prosecutors speak about or think about what their role is? So, I used to be a teacher, and there's lots of ways of talking about teaching, but some of the ways I would speak about it is I saw my role as not wanting to have my students think the same things that I did, or not even necessarily for them to do certain things. I wanted them to think in the same rhythms that I did, and it might lead to different decisions. And it took me 10 years of teaching to get kind of to that idea. And I think that's a really good one. And I heard other people say that, and it made me feel good. But for prosecutors, how do they think about their role, or how would they say, my job is this? Is it to prosecute, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you come up in a good office, good meaning more in tuned and understanding of what that power means and how you can hold that power. I came up in an office where we were told our job is to do justice. And that's a very different distinction than an office where you are told your job is to get convictions. Because you can imagine if you are told, and that is your mindset, is everything that comes in, my job is to get a conviction, you are less likely to do those dismissals, those diversions. You might overlook, the constitutional violations, because what you're being told is you need to get convictions. I at least came up in an office where, if we knew there was a constitutional violation, the expectation was that you were going to dismiss that case, or, that you should be thinking about what is just in this instance. And, but I as we'll talk more about my journey, I think even with the best of intentions, essentially still prosecutors have such limited tools. If you think so much of what the system's response is to show up after an incident has happened. And essentially the tools you usually have are to then investigate and then punish for that incident. And so, you can have best intentions, but ultimately, even those things we were talking about, like problem-solving courts, a drug court, a veterans court, a mental health court, or diversion, usually only exists for lower level offenses. There are very, very few exceptions where it's for felonies or violent crimes. And so much of what you do, because you eventually get out of those lower level cases, you're handling more serious cases, essentially is to investigate and then seek a conviction and then to punish.
Wow. I mean, you said do justice, which to me echoes so much Micah 6:8, which is the evangelical network's verse about we're called to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly
before
and
God. Yes.
Part of what's such a key piece of EJUSA is talking about that our nation seems to have this idea that justice and punishment are synonymous. And we're saying that that's actually not it. So even if someone says to do justice, well, how does that person define what it is?
Yeah.
Is there ever a discussion in prosecutors' offices about truth and about pursuing truth? Does that relate to when they say do justice? Is that part of what's implied?
Yeah, I would definitely say that again, and I have to make the caveat in certain offices, because it's not, I mean, as you know, I know you know, Sam, but and I'm sure many of the folks who are participating know, it's not that we have one system. We have many systems. And what can happen in Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi can be responded to very differently in New York, or it all, depending on who runs your system. So yeah, like in an office that is a better office, then yes, like your job in that investigation phase is to pursue the truth. It is, there's a desire to corroborate, what you're being told is what happened, and find what other evidence you can find that backs that up, corroborates that. So yes, seeking the truth. And then sometimes that truth means, I had a case like this where the person who was arrested was literally not the person. Like, we had the wrong person. That person was detained pre-trial. And it actually took me convincing his lawyer that I meant well, like that his lawyer was looking forward to trial, was, because he had this great evidence to show it wasn't his client, and he wasn't entertaining any plea offers. And I finally had to just say to him, listen, if you think we got this wrong, don't wait to trial to show the evidence that we got this wrong. Like, if we have this wrong, tell me now. Like, instead of your client being detained all this time until we get to trial. But it took him a minute, because, it's an adversarial system. How is he going to show his hand to the other side? But I had to convince him I really meant well. Like, if we have the wrong person, we need to let this person out, and eventually we had to do that. I had to bring the victim in, show her the evidence they had that was different than our evidence. So, it's the truth is certainly a big part of it.
You said, and this is such a key piece of the system, that it's so adversarial, right? Yes. I mean, even in the way where people are sitting, the way that the process goes, it's these parallel groups opposed to each other. And even of how trials are spoken of, the people or a state or a place versus often this individual. And it's never the people in support of a victim, or the case is not spoken of in that way. The person who's the victim or the survivor is often sidelined or used, but that adversarial piece is huge. And it wasn't until it was many years until I was able to see from the beginning all the way through either release or conviction or someone going to prison, the way that it was by design meant to be adversarial. And you said something else, and I feel both of these things are true, that in one sense, there's this criminal legal system that is this thing and has in a way, a one size fits all of how it responds, this lens of punishment and control. And at the same time, there are nuances of it can look very differently in a county or in a different place within our country. And I think about education too, right? Like, there's the public school system, but yet the way it can be expressed can be in different ways. So do you see a way for the system to be done well? Do you see the system as completely thwarted in its attempts? Or I put it this way, is the system capable of bringing about and doing justice?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Such a great question. I mean, so I can't answer that question without, of course, defining justice or redefining it, right?
Yeah.
Because I just want to
Yeah.
underscore the point you were making about justice meaning punishment. And I think that is definitely the case when we think about what justice means in the system. So there were many times I stood before a judge and said, this is how we get justice for the victim in this case.
Mhm.
Essentially, what I meant was punishment, because there was little else we could offer, to
Mhm.
the person who had suffered the harm, and this is usually in a violent crime case. And so here at EJUSA, what I just so appreciate about what we do is one of the kind of first frameworks is redefining justice as safety, healing, and accountability that repairs. And so if we think about that redefined justice, can the system do that? The answer is no. Like there's no healing in the criminal legal system, because it is set up to be this adversarial thing where, and I think it's interesting to underscore that 95% of cases don't go to trial. So
Mhm.
we use a framework of trial where you're going to go and one side wins or loses because they have to convince a jury one way or the other. But 95% of cases don't even get, that's not what happens. Like the
Right.
vast majority are pled out. The vast majority are resolved short of trial. And so we should actually have a system that's set up that's like the parties come together to figure out what's the best result here, not
Right.
this sort of battle,
Mm,
stance.
mhm.
And so if again, under that redefined definition of justice, the system's sole focus on who did it, and then punishing them for it, it doesn't take into consideration truly what a victim or survivor needs. It
Mhm.
also doesn't take into consideration that the person who caused the harm almost always, and I use that almost lightly because I just feel like there can always be an exception, but
Right.
I think the
Right.
vast majority themselves were harmed. I
Mhm.
never had a violent crime case in all my years where the person who caused harm had not been harmed themselves, and almost always it had started in childhood,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
instead of seeing, it to me, what it shows is our failure as a society, and instead of helping and supporting a person who's experienced harm in the moment and making
Mhm.
sure that we're addressing the trauma, we're meeting those needs so that that trauma is a driver of violence, so they don't end up being someone who's hurting someone else.
Right.
Instead, we put all our money into, again, police, prosecution, prisons. And so all we do is continue to punish after the fact. And we actually rarely address the fact that the person who caused the harm was first a victim.
Right. Right. And that system, another thing we don't acknowledge is that the system itself is bringing about that trauma.
Yeah.
It's perpetuating that cycle. And then
Yeah.
and you said 95% of cases don't go to trial. And we also know 95% of people who are in prison come out. So we
Yeah.
know that those individuals are going to return to society at minimum where they were before. And in most cases, at a worse
Often worse.
place.
Yeah.
We had a shooting here in Charlottesville a few months ago of police who shot and killed a man, and there was a chase involved, and there was a shelter-in-place order for our kids while they were in school, and it took a lot of conversations at home for our kids to process what that was. But our oldest, my 7-year-old, was talking about it, and when we were explaining, because rightly they didn't at school, but when I sat her down that night and said, "Here's what happened," and said what happened, her response about the police were shooting the man was, "Why did they feel they had to do that?" And it struck me, one, I was thrilled that she was thinking about that there were other options. And to a degree, to the police credit, because I read the report, there was a lot that they tried to do, but they still shot and killed the man. And that system almost made that inevitable. But yet her asking that question, I had to pause and think of what to say. And I said, and I'd never thought this until that moment, I said, think about what's on a police officer's belt. These are
Mhm.
all tools of violence and control. And that's what they're equipped with. And you said that too a second ago about the system, that the tools are really limited to
Yeah.
jail, to prison, to execution, or the threat of those things.
Yeah.
And that's what's there. I want to pause and make sure and get some nuances in terms, just as I always think that's helpful and a good reminder for people. Can you talk for a moment of two things: difference of jail versus prison, just so that people make sure we have that in our mind, because those are different. And then bail versus bond. Sometimes those are used really interchangeably.
Yeah. So jail is essentially used for pretrial detention. And so you were talking about that number, right? The number of people who have been arrested, and up until the point you are convicted, you are legally innocent until proven guilty. That is your constitutional standing. So when a judge, usually, or in a good system, it's a judge who makes a determination. Oh, except for when money. Okay, so I'm going to get to bail and bond in a minute. Sometimes the decision is made that a person should be detained before that, before you get to trial, before there's a finding of guilt or innocence, or guilt or not guilt. That that's usually in jail. So you are held in jail. The other people that you often find in jail are people who are serving out misdemeanor sentences. So again, a misdemeanor is a lower level offense where you are sentenced to less than a year or a year or less. And so often those sentences are served out in jail. Prisons are where they're post-conviction, you've been convicted, it's a felony, and you are serving some time longer than a year. In most counties, most jurisdictions have some of both, jails and prisons. And then the difference between bail and bond, which is related, right? Because a lot of people who are in jail are there because a city or county has some kind of cash bail or cash bond system. And what that means is, the judge will say, all right, you've got this arrest for this shoplifting. Your trial dates, 9 months from now, and know that those trial dates are then going to be continued, because many trials don't happen for a long time after the incident occurred. And if you want to go home, you can pay this amount, and if it's bail, it's usually the person or the family dealing directly with the court, and they pay the amount. If it's bond, it's using some third party, like a bondsman, who is essentially taking the risk of whether or not you're going to appear or fail to appear, but often charging a very high fee for that. But essentially what it results in is there are a bunch of folks who are held in jail simply because they're poor, simply because they don't have access to resources. And so it's, something that how much poverty influences who is impacted by our system. And we also understand there are racial dynamics to that as well. And it seems pretty simple to think about it, right? That if you think a person is dangerous and you think they should be detained because they're a threat to others, then that shouldn't be tied to money, then but in many cases, it's just about money. So it has nothing to do with whether you're dangerous or not. It's whether or not you have money, and that fundamentally just doesn't make sense when what it's supposed to be about is how you keep the community safe.
Yeah. I might butcher the paraphrase I'm thinking of with Brian Stevenson, but he says something to the effect of the system favors far more those who are rich and guilty than those who are poor and innocent.
Yeah.
That balance of guilt and innocence is not really what tipped the scale, but that money plays a huge role within it.
Yeah.
Well, you know the system well, you were within it in a lot of deep ways, and then you made some conscious decisions to shift out of it. What was the road? What was the road from being inside the system, and it sounds like kind of part of it, then wanting to reform it, and then moving out of it to do something wholly different? What was that road?
Yeah, it was really like it was a learning process. I think I went into the system. There are a lot of folks who literally knew from undergrad or maybe before that they wanted to be, because I was an assistant U.S. attorney, I was an AUSA, which is a federal prosecutor, which is kind of a highly sought after position in law enforcement. A lot of AUSAs gone to be judges and federal judges, and so as I didn't know what they were. It was a mentor once I was out of law school working, and I was, trying to figure out what do I do with this law degree. But as I was researching, I'm like coming across all they're literally guidebooks, how to become an AUSA. And so there are some folks who grow up with this is how I want to be a public servant. I'm going to take this path that can maybe lead to the bench one day. Whereas I went in more when the mentor suggested it to me, kind of more with the side eye, like, all right, you know, the system is not always fair, particularly to Black communities. I already by that point had cousins who'd been incarcerated. My own brother ended up incarcerated behind a substance use disorder. And so I went in more with an eye of understanding, and this was the conversation we had, that if the system actually isn't fair all the time and actually does cause harm, particularly to certain groups, well, why not be a power holder in it who can use that power differently? So I went in more with that eye, like, you know, I want to, you know, I want to be a person, one, who knows that the person on the other side of these decisions is, first of all, a person, because the dehumanization that exists in the system, particularly as we talk about in conditions of confinement in our jails and prisons, is it's horrific. It's horrific. But that dehumanization begins at the very beginning. You are called defendant. We were trained as prosecutors. No, you don't use their name. The defendant. You take that name away. You make them this person who did this act, you know, in front of the jury. And so being someone who could like automatically like, no, this is a person, and see humanity and want to push back against some of that dehumanization. But I'll say it didn't, you know, again, and also learning about other things that prosecutors could do besides send, you know, help send people to prison, right? Like, oh, you can connect people to services. You know, my first route was through the domestic violence route. And I remember just feeling like, you know, being one, appreciating the chance to work directly with families who were in the midst of crisis and dealing with harm, but help them understand this is particularly in the misdemeanor realm, that the answer didn't have to be sending your husband or sending your partner or sending your father, you know, to jail. We can craft something where they have to get anger management. They have to take some classes. They've got to, you know, and that felt a little more solution oriented. But those options go away when you get some more serious cases, and they just aren't the options. And I think I did just over time realize, like, you can bring the most wanting to do it differently, you know, understanding the impact, wanting to humanize, but a system that is rooted in racial oppression, which is why I always say to you, Sam, I love that you were a history teacher, because the historical lens to me is one of the most important lenses to this work. I mean, it's history that tells us that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as punishment for crime, you know? So when we understand that foundation of the system, then the racial disparities we see are not surprising, and they're going to continue. And so, you know, there's only so much you can do, because the system's going to do what it's going to do. You just become part of it, you know? And so getting the chance to do some policy work in the Obama administration helped me to see the forest and not just the trees, the individual. Go do justice in this case. Well, that justice in those cases were leading to this system of mass incarceration, and understanding that there were better solutions and other drivers that were influencing all of that. And so then going to the very Institute of Justice, where there was this opportunity to work with prosecutors elected on platforms of change, you know, to end mass incarceration, address racial disparities, be more transparent, was this opportunity to write policies and do trainings inside of offices where it's not just trying to have change on a case by case, but change a system, right? You know, but what I found in doing that work after a few years was the frustration that even that reform work, which reform meaning you're trying to reduce the harm of the system, there was always an exception for violence, you know. So whatever that new policy was, there was a carve out except for violent crime. We'll do this except for violent crime. And we're never going to address these problems unless we treat violence differently. And in fact, you know, think about what drives violence and address those drivers instead of just punishing after the fact. So hearing about the work that was already happening here at EJUSA, and, you know, getting outreach about this role to come in and lead, felt like the next, it literally, I just think God has truly ordered my steps and ordered this path for me. And, you know, that I needed to experience the system to really understand that we're never going to fix it. We need a different foundation of healing, of repair, of love, if we're going to really address these problems differently. But I needed to experience it and walk through it. And what does it mean to, you know, try to work in it and fix it that way, or work outside of it and fix it that way, to now be in a place where I understand and feel it's such a privilege to build solutions outside on a different foundation.
I mean, you talked about it of this learning journey, and I love hearing that of just you were within the system, working within it. You had the proximity through your brother of his experience there and seeing that. And then you started thinking about reform, and then you started moving towards, I don't know if you use this word, but a transformational vision, a wholly other thing. And it's sometimes I'll tell people the work that we do wants to thumbs up and support the work of reform. And
Yes.
yet what we're doing is calling for something else. I often talk to others and say at EJUSA, we want to go find those individuals doing that work on the ground, closest to the harm in this trauma-informed way. And we want to elevate and we want to support those groups. And you talked about redefining justice and reimagining these things. One of the best things I think is that we get to do is we don't just have to say, what if we did this other thing? It's pointing to, it's here, it's happening in these pockets and places across the country. And it's sparking people's imaginations with something that's real rather than just with an idea.
Yeah.
So you had tragedy also strike your family with your father. What happened there? And at what point in that learning journey that you gave, did that come in and affect some of your decisions?
Yeah, so my dad was the victim of a robbery when I was in high school. And to this day, we don't know the full details. We know he was hit in the head. He was on his way to his second job. It was very early in the morning. He used to deliver newspapers for the New York Times, which meant he was leaving the house at like 3:30 or something in the morning. And he'd do that before he went to his job working for the city of Detroit. And the doctors said they didn't know if it was like a brick or a bat, but he was hit in the head with something really hard. And he was in intensive care for several weeks. He suffered a traumatic brain injury. And, you know, it was an incredible just journey that not just he had to walk, but our family had to walk, because even once he came out of the coma initially, the injuries were so severe, he had to relearn everything. He had to learn to talk again. He had to learn to walk again. He had to learn to read again. He had taught me to drive before the injury had happened. And I remember years later teaching him to drive, you know, as he had to relearn everything. And so the impacts of that, you know, it's definitely, I think I understand more fully now, you know, like as, you know, it's just age and maturing. I don't know that I've always appreciated that that was a lens that was coloring some of what I was doing. And I think about like that work in domestic violence cases and really wanting to support families, because they, you know, the police were involved. They never found, we actually think it was younger folks, because they took the car and took his wallet, and the car was found a few blocks later, and just kind of like, they think it was younger kids, you know, who probably didn't even have a clue, you know, what that one act would do to him or to his family. And so the system didn't have any answers for us. Like as we walked through, essentially now I have the words, the trauma, you know, back then I didn't have those words of, you know, almost losing our home, you know, the mental toll it took on my mom and on us as children, and all the various ways it showed up in our lives, including my brother's substance use disorder, is, you know, it changed everything for us, you know. But it's interesting because I just recently wrote about this during Crime Victims' Rights Week. I've never identified myself as a survivor of violence, you know, like, and I don't think it's a thing that's common to just me. I think Black and Brown people generally don't just kind of take on the label of as victim or survivor easily, you know, like, and I think there's a whole lot to unpack underneath that, the whys behind that. But I think that's one of our paths forward, right? Like if we think about EJUSA, and so much of our work is about how do we, through a trauma-informed lens, interrupt the cycles of violence. Part of it is understanding there are folks who are victims and survivors who may not even know it, who may not self-identify as victims and survivors, but that we need to be making sure needs are being met, and we're supporting them, instead of then seeing the actions that come out of it and then later punishing, and exacerbating those things.
Right. I've seen this happen. So Lionel Latouche, as you know, is one of our staff at EJUSA. He helps lead our Trauma to Trust program. And I saw him presenting at a conference last year, and he was defining trauma and then gave a little bit of time for people in the audience to react. It was 150 people or so that were there. And there were some people who said out loud in that time, I never thought of myself as someone who experienced trauma until you said it that way. And part of it literally was giving language and a label to someone's experience who had not thought of it that way before. And until they did, they can't really pursue their healing, right?
Yeah.
Until they have those tools and that language, then you don't know what ways can others around you, how can you pursue services, or how can you ask for help until there's that light bulb moment of that label. And so that moment is huge.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if we can get to a point as a society, right, like where we see the person who caused harm first as a victim or survivor, even in that moment, after they've committed the harmful act, that we first see them as the person who is acting out their trauma, our response would be totally different than what we do, and I think that's part of why our work to change the narrative around, what safety means and what justice means, and to broaden that definition of who's a victim and who's a survivor is so critical, because I think that's going to be one of the main paths to getting us to do things differently when it comes to responding to harm.
Absolutely. So you came on as executive director at EJUSA a little less than 2 years ago. You're almost at your 2-year mark.
Yeah.
And EJUSA has a couple decade history. How have things shifted once you've come on, both a vision and what the work looks like?
Yeah. Well, first, I actually this week had the chance to connect with our founding executive director, Sherry Silverstein. She was in town for a conference, and we've only seen each other in person. This was the second time. And so we got to spend some time together, and it is always such a privilege and an honor, because I'll always be grateful for something that she gave birth to, that she worked at for 21 years, and then she trusted me and handed it over to me, and then handed it over to me in a way that made room for my vision, and I think one of the ways that, to me, and I also want us to name, she did it with intention of stepping back as a white woman who was leading a work in a team that by that point was nearly 75% staff of color, and a work that was really honing in on a racial equity lens. She made the decision she needed to step back and look for a leader of color who was more closely impacted and tied to the work. And I think that definitely has been part of the shift is, Sherry, from so many decades of working with survivors, and particularly beginning first in the anti-death penalty spaces and then broadening into this work now where we're building community safety, brought very much that trauma lens, to our work. And it's still a very key lens to our work. I think I bring, my first lens is racial justice, and just understanding that these harms are happening and these traumas are happening, but there's certain groups of people who are bearing the brunt of it much more deeply than other groups of people. And that if we don't kind of understand the historical context, again, that has intentionality behind that. It's not by accident. There's real intentionality behind that, that all of the efforts we can do to fix things, if we don't apply that lens, will continue to disproportionately harm Black and Brown people. And I'll give a quick example of what I mean by that. In my work I was doing at Vera, one of these tools prosecutors have to not bring people into the system and to not have a harmful response is diversion. But in most diversion programs across this country, first, there's a cost associated. So you got to pay money to be able to participate in the diversion program. Second, most diversion programs have a requirement that you have little to no record or prior interaction with the system. And when you think about just even those two things, so we know that Black and Brown communities are heavily surveilled and are more likely to have police contact. Some of it is sometimes because things are the individuals doing things that bring them to police attention. A lot of times it's just because you live in the neighborhood, and so you're put on lists at potential gang affiliations, beat crews. There's all kinds of, because of all that surveillance in particular neighborhoods, that you're more likely as a Black person to have had contact, whether that's an arrest, or whether that's conviction. We know sometimes some of these convictions are false. We've got more exonerations in 2022. It's one of the highest years of exoneration. So we know a lot of times, even when there's a conviction, it's wrong, it's false. So if you think about from diversion, if you require no contact with the system, you require money to be able to pay, because we know, again, under-resourced communities are often Black and brown communities. So the likelihood that you have the money to pay to access this diversion. So if you're gonna expand diversion and you do it without a racial justice lens, you're gonna just continue to make that disparity worse, you know? And so even for the solutions, you gotta apply a racial justice lens so that you remove those barriers, and so that the solution can actually be accessible to everyone. And I would dare say that it needs to target explicitly the communities that have been most harmed by the system's response.
I've heard you use a phrase like this, and others as well, of something close to, we want those who are closest to harm, we believe they're closest to the solutions, and we want them closest to seats of power to be able to have say and control over their own community safety, which is another thing that you've said. What do you mean when you talk about community safety, and how's that different than when police talk about public safety?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why I love our work and what we do, right? You know, I think part of a lot of what we do is ask people what safety means to them. And when we ask that question, you get lots of beautiful answers. I remember one person responding that people know my name when I'm walking down the street in my neighborhood, right? You know, safety means, you know, green spaces where I can get outside and breathe. Safety can mean well-lit streets, you know, so that when I'm walking and it's nighttime, you know, I can see the areas around me. Very rarely, if ever, does someone say, what makes you, you know, what do you think of when you think of safety, or what makes you feel safe? Do they say, oh, more police, you know? And in fact, I would say there are times when you see police, what it does is flag for you that something must have happened. And it can give you a feeling of, this happened to me recently, going to a place I used to go all the time. And I came in, and it's a little strip mall in an area I used to live, and they had police strategically placed at all the entrances. And it was clear, so there could be, you know, sirens were off. It was just their lights were on. It was clearly an effort to have more visible police presence at the strip mall. And what it did for me was say, something must have happened here, you know? And so it made me feel less safe going to the place that I was usually going. So I think when we ask people, what does safety mean to them? They tell us, and they tell us it's the things that make communities thrive. And so part of our work is helping people understand that safety is more than the absence of violence. It's not just that bad things aren't happening. It's actually that folks have what they need and the ability to thrive. And that requires a very different response from our government, from our power holders, and how we use our resources.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said this, that safety isn't just this absence of violence, but it's the presence of other things that make and bring and feel like true safety. And another word that we use is the idea of well-being. And that we want not just violence gone, but well-being present. I mean, Christians talk about shalom, this ultimate peace and a settledness that is there. So I've got one more question, and then we'll take a look at some of the questions that have come in the chat and in the Q&A. And again, anybody listening, you're welcome to put in any thoughts or questions there, and we'll get to those in a second. But you've alluded to this a bit. What role does your faith play in all of this? How does that shape and animate what you do?
Yeah. Well, it's so deeply tied to who I am as a person that there's nothing I can do that's not, you know, through essentially God's power, God's favor, God's grace in my life. And so I and I feel like he has truly ordered my steps. Like I didn't know what my path was, and but he has revealed to me each place, because each place I've gone has not been because I sought it out. It's been because there's been really intentional direction, really intentional doors opening. And I think I'm still surprised by the ways that God, and humbled by the way God is using me in this world, and has given me a platform in very unexpected ways. Like I'm just a girl from Detroit, and I like it's amazing to me what God has done, and that he's not done, but I think, when I think about our work, I really get excited, particularly about this work and about the ways that faith really intersects with what we need to have a world where violence is rare, to achieve the vision we have as an organization. And essentially, again, when we were talking about the foundation of the system, which is racial oppression and the desire to control, that we have this opportunity to build on a different foundation. And I think the Bible's really clear about what that looks like when you walk it out. Jesus's life he was born into a time of oppression, and essentially the answer is love. It's why the greatest commandment is to love God, but then to love your neighbor as yourself. And that to me is ultimately the answer. Like, how do we tear down racial division? How do we tear down inequality and inequity that exists? It's if you love someone as much as you love yourself, you will treat them in a very different way than we treat people in our society. I mean, I keep thinking about Jordan Neely, who was killed in the subway car in New York City, who essentially began that sort of incident, and as he was speaking out, asking for help, saying he was hungry, saying he was thirsty, and how if we were operating in love, and if we were following the example of Jesus's love, then what if just one person had given him what he was asking for, had tried to meet that need, but so much of our response is to other and ostracize, to categorize, to take differences and use them as a means for separation, and to justify the way we mistreat and dehumanize certain people, that the antidote to all of that is love. And to me, that is very much what the Bible calls us to do, what our faith calls us to do. And I think if we can set that example and do more of that, and I think there are so many people who are doing that, and that's part of our work, is uplifting those models and those examples, that we can truly have the world that we want, that will be this, just this place of thriving communities where there's well-being present.
Yeah, and it's something that I think people of faith, and especially Christians, have and need to have a role in.
Yes.
I met a couple years ago Sister Helen Prejean, and in person here in Virginia, we were having a luncheon celebrating the end of the death penalty here earlier that year. And she knew EJUSA, but she didn't know me. And I'd just come in as the manager for our evangelical network. And I introduced myself and I said who I was with. And she grabs my hand and she said, "Sam, the evangelicals, they're the key to the whole thing." And it was just this moment of, I think I'd take what she said and expand it just to Christians as a whole. And I think what she's getting at, the key to the whole thing, kind of in two ways. In one sense, Christians are largely responsible for constructing the system that we have. We know that prisons, when they began in the 1700s, were modeled off of monasteries, that it was Christians who were wanting to do a different version of that model and believe that transformation of a person could come from confinement. We know that that doesn't work. We know that Christianity has had an undue influence on this system. But at the same time, we also have this potential to call on Christians and their focus on love and restoration to not just continue that system, but to do something else. So while Christians have had a huge hand in building this, they can have a great hand, not just in undoing it, but in building that other thing. And so the key to the whole thing. I desperately want to call Christians to join in that work because churches already are these pockets. I
Yeah,
say to people sometimes, imagine if we had thousands of small communities of 100 or 200 people across the country who talked about love and care of neighbor. And if we could activate them to engage in these ways, and we do, and those are called
yeah,
churches, and
yeah,
they're all across the country. And they have
yeah,
at the core, just like you said, so deeply intertwined with who they are, these
yeah,
views and these ideas and these loves that can transform what they do.
yes.
There's a couple questions that get in, some of them broad, some of them deep into the weeds in a great way that I want to make sure that we get to. So one individual was asking, going back to some of the things at the beginning, Jami, we talked about, they said kind of two things. Who's responsible for a thorough investigation of a criminal act? And then does the person charged get or have the right to discover all the facts about their case?
Yeah. So investigation largely lies in most jurisdictions with police. But then I would say, particularly in serious cases, the prosecutor will conduct its own investigation. So the prosecutor's office will work closely with police. And if we think about federal, it's FBI, it's other agencies. There's a bunch of different law enforcement agencies all charged with investigation. And so, and that is trying to get, it's looking, talking to all the people who are the witnesses. It's, pulling cell phone records, it's pulling, any camera footage, all the corroboration. So it's kind of a joint, between starting with the police or the law enforcement agency that's on the ground, but often includes the prosecutor's office. And then, yes, like before a trial starts, the person who's accused they have a right to all of the information. The term is called discovery, where every police report, every video recording, every cell phone record has to be turned over and shared with the defense counsel and the person accused in preparation for trial. And there's a lot of, like, Brady is a rule where if you find anything that is exculpatory, whether you're getting, you have to quickly turn that over, so something that actually says maybe it wasn't your client, needs to be turned over. So definitely there's a right to that information. And a good defense lawyer is doing their own investigation. It's just that in most places in this country, public defense is woefully underfunded, woefully. So they carry many, many cases, and in most cases don't have the ability to conduct their own investigation. I worked in a system in DC where it's probably the leading public defender service in the country, the DC Public Defender Service, where they investigated, they brought in their own experts, and that's
That's exceptional.
that's what you need for a fair trial. But that is by far the exception and not the rule.
Okay. I mean, and I feel like from what you're saying, I don't need to ask, but it seems like a conflict of interest that harms the person who's the victim and the survivor, and even that person who's the defendant. The fact that the prosecutor is able to work in conjunction with the police and accessing all of those resources to investigate, all bent on, for some, not all, prosecution.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, that's the goal. You're gathering the evidence because you believe you've got the person, or you're trying to identify the person, but it's to get a conviction. That is the point. You're not going out there looking for evidence to show it wasn't. That's why you need well-funded defense, because that's what they're doing. They're going out, trying to make sure to test all the things and gather other information. But you're very right to pull out that investigation is happening with a certain lens, for sure.
Someone else has asked, how can people better advocate for change directly with prosecutors? What does that look like? And I throw in there maybe saying what a progressive prosecutor is. I know that's another term that's grown within the field, if that can play a role.
Yeah. I know there are folks who push back against that term.
Oh, absolutely.
I personally don't use it because of that, because
I don't either, but
they don't exist.
I
You
know
can't
people
have
have heard it.
and prosecute. But yes, there is a term used for this movement, essentially, of these prosecutors. Again, very community driven. It's because communities started to recognize the power and influence held by this office and by this person, and started to demand change and organize and get involved in these elections. Because again, vast majority are elected in this country, and most run unopposed. Most hold their offices for very, very long. And so there's a lot, you know, the ACLU has done a ton of work, and there's a Color of Change, and there are a number of organizations that have done work on essentially public education, going into a jurisdiction, particularly where there's a prosecutor who's doing awful things, you know, and really misusing that power, educating the community, the organizers on the ground, and then it's often convincing someone to run against them, you know, supporting them. And we're seeing success. We're seeing a number of folks elected on these platforms of change. So definitely, first, it's just like vote, get involved in your elections. You know, we know that elections participation is awful. You know, the numbers are so low. Who's determining who our leaders are? And then two, like, you know, if you have a prosecutor, if you get to like learn what your prosecutor's policies are, like what are they doing? There's court watching. Courts are public. Anyone can go in and sit and watch and see. And there's some organizations that organize specific court watching to provide some of that accountability about what's happening in the system. But there are lots of ways to engage and get involved.
Great. I want to also point people towards EJUSA as a whole. So we're on Facebook, and we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram. You can find all of us there. If you go to ejusa.org, you can also sign up for the email list. And you've been busy writing things too. I just sent out to the Evangelical Network at least one or two of your recent articles, but you've been sharing your story and offering some critique and some solutions and spaces, and pointing to work in places like Newark. So I know one way to keep up with your work is just being on that email list to see some of the things that we're doing and the ways that you're bringing a lens to it as well.
Yes.
Well, I answered the question. I was going to say, how can people keep up with the work that's going on? But but they're the ways, and we want people hearing those things. Again, we want people knowing that we're not asking people to come into something that doesn't exist. We're asking people to join in a movement that is already there.
Yes.
So, Jami, thank you. One, for coming to EJUSA and bringing your story, your experience, your lens, for bringing and continuing a vision, for bringing nuances to that vision, for leading us well, and for all that you shared today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, and think right back at you, Sam. Like, this is, I think Sister Helen is onto something. This work that you're leading is incredibly important. It's been flourishing under your leadership, and I'm just excited for what we're going to continue to build together. So thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I love that. This is the next thing I'll say. I'll put this in the chat. So next month's In the Movement webinar is on Thursday, June 22nd, and it's with Laura Porter, who's the executive director of the Eighth Amendment Project. And they're an umbrella organization that's helping to move and fund and help guide a lot of the death penalty movement, the federal and the state level work for repeal within the country. And Laura Porter used to work at EJUSA, and she was integral in beginning in 2017 the Evangelical Network, and that she and Heather Bodwin and others deeply believed in that work. So she's going to come and talk about that transition of why EJUSA had the foresight to think about that work and this national death penalty movement. So we'll get to hear again some more of the nuance to the EJUSA story next month. So people can register there. You can go ahead and register. And if you're on our email list, we'll send that out. Also, if you're on our email list, I'll email you all either today or tomorrow a link to a video of this. So you have that, as well as links to social media for EJUSA so that you can follow everything that's happening and the things that are going on. So Jami, again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to everybody who was here. Blessings on your day. And I hope that everybody can join us next month. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.